So 12 months ago, the race share price was about 6 cents, and today it's sitting around 91 cents. There have been a number of major catalysts for that. Firstly, the introduction of the company's 5-path strategy for the development of its chemotherapeutic Bisantrene, which it's bringing back to market. Secondly, in recent weeks, many of you will be aware that new data has been released on the drug. This new data showed that the drug can still work in today's population, and in fact it exceeded the expectations of management. Thirdly, a large and completely independent preclinical study identified further vast potential for Bisantrene, and in recent weeks Race made a placement to strategic investors, very high quality investors, underscoring interest in what's going on with the company at the moment. So without giving up all of the good oil, at this point I'd like to hand over to Dr. Daniel Tillett, who'll run us through all of this in more detail. Thanks, Daniel.
Welcome everyone. This is a good opportunity to update those of you who know the story about what's been happening over the last couple of months, and a brief introduction for those who are new to the story. The question really is, why Bisantrene? And this is what attracted me to the company about 12 months ago, and why I came in as a cornerstone investor in August last year. This is the historical data of Bisantrene in acute myeloid leukemia, which is a very hard to treat leukemia. And the response rates were quite astounding. These were all done in the 80s and 90s. And this really impressed me. I thought, wow, how could a drug this good be lost? The second thing that drew me to Bisantrene was that it actually cured people. In cancer, it's so difficult to actually cure patients rather than just add a few months to their life. These are the case histories of 2 French girls that were treated in the 1980s and 1990s. They'd failed all other treatment. They were given Bisantrene and a bone marrow transplant, and they were cured. They're still alive today. They both have their own families. And this is something that a drug like Bisantrene can actually do. And to have lost something like this from our medical arsenal against something like cancer is more than a sad outcome. If you're not interested on that side of things, from a financial perspective, leukemia has become a very viable area in oncology over the last 30 years. When Bisantrene was dropped, it was AML was a backwater. The amount of money you could make from selling a drug was very limited. Maybe $10 million a year might be, cutting edge. These days, thanks to changes in the oncology market, and particularly in what you can charge for a drug, oncology drugs sell for multi-billion-dollar amounts very early in development. So this is an example of 5 different oncology transactions that have occurred over the last 8 years in the AML and leukemia space. We're talking an average of, $2.5 billion per transaction. There's a lot of money to be made developing drugs for rare diseases such as leukemia, or relatively rare diseases such as leukemia and AML. Just a bit of an overview of the company for those of you who are unfamiliar. We have a relatively small number of shares on issue. I'm sure many of you are used to looking at biotechs that have a couple of billion shares on issue. We have relatively few. And one of the reasons why is that the board and management has a large direct shareholding. Almost a quarter of the company is held by the board. We have bought all our shares. So we're extremely interested in avoiding excessive dilution. The company, as Jane mentioned, in the last 12 months has really gone for quite a run on the back of a change in strategy and some excellent results, particularly in the last month. We're sitting around an enterprise value of around $100 million at the moment and market cap of a bit over 110. I won't go into too much detail on the board and management other than to say that we're all extremely experienced in this space, done this type of thing before. We have the right people in place and we have the right advisors in place to bring a drug like Bisantrene back onto the market. So what was it about Bisantrene that attracted me? Well, the historical data attracted me, but what's really driven the share price in the last couple of months or a month and a half, where it's gone from around 30 cents to nearly $1, is two pieces of information that were released. The first of these was the results of a phase 2 clinical trial that we were running in Israel at the Sheba Medical Center. And the second was an independent piece of work that identified Bisantrene as a potent inhibitor of FTO. Both of these things effectively acted as a 1-2 punch to the share price and really changed the story of what Bisantrene is about and what RACE was about. The first one that came out was the phase 2 clinical trial results. So this was a small trial, but it was at a phase 2. So these were active treatment at the treatment dosage known to work best from the historical data from the 80s and 90s. 10 patients were treated, and these 10 patients were relapsed and refractory. And basically, these are patients that have failed all existing and experimental treatment and were extremely close to death. They had weeks to live, not months. They were given a single cycle of treatment, and the trial was run under the management of Professor Arnon Nagler in Israel. The results exceeded our expectation. These days, it's very rare to do clinical trials on a single agent. Everything these days is combinations of drugs. There's many more drugs available these days. And yet, despite that, using a protocol that was effectively identical to the 1980s, we achieved an overall response rate of around 40%. And not only that, we achieved that in the hardest to treat patient population group, which were those that had extramedullary disease. And extramedullary disease is where the leukemia escapes your bone marrow and basically starts to grow in other parts of your body, including under your skin, in some of the patients in their breast, in their brain, in their eye. All these, when the cancer gets into those tissues, it's very hard to treat. And yet those were the patients that responded best to Bisantrene. One of the most important things that we saw, we saw a high level of safety and no unexpected toxicities. This is always something when you bring a drug back from the past, what was acceptable 30, 40 years ago is not acceptable anymore. But yet we actually saw far fewer toxicities in the historical data. Most likely because we actually manufactured the drug to a higher standard than they used to, and actually treated the patients better. That was a really outstanding result. The other thing that came in June, in the same week, just coincidentally, was the identification by the City of Hope, a group of researchers there who had been studying this protein called FTO, which stands for fat and obesity associated protein. Completely obscure protein. However, this obscure protein sits right in the core part of a whole lot of cancers and is involved in the carcinogenesis and the progression of cancer for a whole range of different cancers across leukemias, lung cancers, breast cancer, ovarian cancers, melanomas, brain tumors, pancreatic, bowel cancer, every cancer you can imagine. Some of those cancers are affected by FTO. And so they were really interested in finding inhibitors for this drug. And so they went to the NCI, the National Cancer Institute in the US, and borrowed effectively the library that they have there, National Cancer Institute. And because the National Cancer Institute had worked on Bisantrene back in the 80s, they had it in their library, and after they finished screening through all the compounds, there's 260,000 compounds in the entire library, they discovered that Bisantrene was the most potent inhibitor of this FTO protein. They went on to show that in a mouse model, that it was extremely potent anti-leukemic at very low dose, about a 20th of the dose that we actually used in our clinical trial. It also inhibited the ability of the cancer to repopulate the bone marrow, which is called cancer stem cell area. It's a very hot and exciting area at the moment in oncology. And the final thing, they actually showed that it enhanced immune rejection of the cancer. So the immune system was unable to overcome the ability of the cancer to escape immune enhancement. And immune oncology is a huge area now. Drugs like Keytruda, the PD-1 inhibitors, have really driven a real breakthrough in cancer. Patients are being treated with these drugs, activating their immune system to the cancer, and they're being cured. But still many of those patients, you'll cure a percentage of them, but there's still many that need more, and Bisantrene offers potential in that area as well. So this result placed Bisantrene right in the middle of the three hottest areas in oncology. So this process, RNA methylation deregulation, which I won't talk about because it's far too technical, cancer stem cell and immuno-oncology. And the really amazing thing about this is it takes Bisantrene from being a boring old chemo drug from the 80s that had some interesting properties, particularly the lack of cardio damage to the heart, but it puts it right as a targeted agent in the hottest areas in oncology. And this changes the dynamic of evaluation of a drug. So if you're looking at it from an investor's point of view, not as a scientist or a clinician, this makes the drug a lot more exciting, and the potential of the upside of a transaction or a sale of a drug much greater. So what does all this mean for race? Well, the most important thing is that we were able to show that Bisantrene still works. We knew that Bisantrene worked really well from the historical data. There had been over 40 clinical trials done in almost 2,000 patients in the 80s and 90s, and where it worked really well. But we didn't know in today's clinical environment whether it would still work. There's been plenty of drugs that worked well in the past that no longer work so well anymore. And so we've been able to show that's not a problem. We've also now know that Bisantrene has two mechanisms of action. So we know it works in two different ways. So if you give it as a high dose, it works like a standard chemotherapeutic drug, but with less damage to the heart. And this is what was known from the 1980s. And we saw the same thing with our recent trial. But we also know that it's got this low dose, low toxicity mechanism of action, so the way that it works. And the beauty of that is that chemotherapy is something that is not very pleasant to go through. It's very hard on the patients. The only thing worse than chemo is the cancer. But many of the targeted agents come with a lot less side effects and toxicities. And if you have an opportunity to make use of these targeted agents, you have a drug that's a lot more appealing. It also opens up the opportunity across a much wider range of different cancers. And on the left-hand side of this presentation is a whole range of totally different unrelated cancers, ranging from leukemias through breast, lung, melanoma, ovarian, testicular, thyroid, every single cancer. This is a wide, really diverse. And this is the expression of FTO is on the y-axis. And you can see that in many cancers, some of those cancers are overexpressing FTO. And that allows an opportunity to, instead of targeting a particular cancer that arose in a particular tissue, so for example, the drug is useful for lung cancer, you have the ability to use Bisantrene in a wide range of different cancers targeted to the particular type of cancer the patient has. So it might be that they've got ovarian cancer, their upregulation of FTO, and so that the doctors will know that Bisantrene is the drug to use to target that. This sort of breakthrough has attracted a lot of interest from people in the field, so key opinion leaders in oncology. So there's a lot of, we're being approached by a lot of people who want to get involved in researching and studying Bisantrene purely because of the FTO story. The great thing about all of this is our IP position is unchanged and robust. We have 4 granted patents. We have orphan drug designation, which gives us US patents, I should say. We have orphan drug designation, which gives us 7 years exclusivity post-approval. So once the drug is approved, we have 7 years when no one else can sell the drug. And we have also designation for rare pediatric disease, which entitles us to a PRV. And I'll talk about that briefly later on. So I won't get into much of the detail about our independent path strategy. You can read all about this on our previous presentations, but we basically have 3 pathways targeting in acute myeloid leukemia, 1, 2, and 3. And we have 2 where we have historical data in breast cancer and ovarian cancer, where we intend to do proof of concept type trials. And so, but before I talk about this, I want to give you a bit of an indication that many investors think you have to run through a phase 3 trial or multiple phase 3 trials that cost tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to run. In AML, or acute myeloid leukemia, there's been a change in heart between of the FDA, and they're now approving drugs very early in development. And so the last drug that was approved for AML in May last year was approved out of a phase 1/2 trial of only 28 patients with a response rate of around 40%, similar to what we have with Bisantrene. This is what you need to do these days to get a drug approved for AML. Even if you have a tiny market, you might think only 1,000 patients, you're still talking $300 million US in sales. And that's just for the US market alone. So this is just one example of a drug. So another example, the drug before that was approved, glitteritinib, that was approved out of a small phase 2 trial, or relatively small phase 2 trial, relatively limited response rate, 21%. Still a small market, and the cost of that drug is $400,000 per year per patient. So small indications in this sort of space can actually go on to be extremely valuable. I obviously don't have enough time to talk you through, but we have an opportunity to make use of the historical data to target a particular niche within AML called MRD that allows you to potentially be able to run a phase 2 trial and go straight to approval very quickly. You'll get a result from running an MRD trial. You'll know the result within 3 to 4 weeks after treatment. And then even the full trial is 6 to 12 months. So this is a potentially approvable trial, and we intend to be running this towards the end of this year, early next year in the US. So that's the trial. We're also doing a whole series of combination trials in various stages of AML in refractory and relapse. One's going to be in Israel. That one's due to start at the end of the year, fully funded for that. And so watch out for that. We'll be running a pediatric trial later that will get us a PRV, potentially worth a few $100 million. And I mentioned before about breast and ovarian cancer. And both of those offer the potential of far greater markets than AML. Even though AML is a great market in its own, breast cancer markets, drugs in that market sell for tens of billions of dollars. So a vastly step up in market size. What to look forward to? Basically, we have a whole bunch of activities on the trials, IND submissions, and then various publications coming out. So this is over the next few months ahead. So we're not just sitting around doing nothing while this is all going on. And I'll just leave on this slide and open up the talk for questions.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a great presentation. Excuse me, got a frog in my throat. Okay, and we have had quite a number of questions come in via the Q&A function. Just a reminder to anybody that would like to ask a question to press the Q&A button in the bottom of the Zoom ribbon, and we'll get through as many as we can in the time that we've got. Can you provide some numbers around potential addressable market?
some of these drugs, for example, CPX-351, that's an AML drug specifically. Some of these other drugs are AML drugs alone. So these are the types of transactions you can expect to. Remember, if you're selling a drug that sells, say, $300 million a year for 1,000 patients, if you take something like MRD, which is you're looking at around 3,500 patients a year, so you look almost 4 times the size of that market, then you're looking let's say $1.2 billion a year in sales. You will sell for a multiple of that, let's say 6 to 7 times is the sort of, you might expect. So, and that's just AML. Remember, AML is a very rare disease, maybe 20,000 cases a year in the US, 50,000 worldwide. Something like breast cancer, which Bisantrene was run through a phase 3 trial back in the 80s, and it performed as well as the existing drugs on the market for breast cancer. That's got 2 million cases a year. You're talking a market that's vastly larger. And I guess something that's not well known by many people outside is that what the drug's approved for has almost no, it doesn't concern the oncologists. It might be the drug's approved for AML, but if it works in breast cancer, they just use it in breast cancer. So it doesn't actually matter. You just need to get approval for a single indication, and then it'll get used off-label. And 70% of all the drug use in the oncology space is used off-label.
Thank you. Okay, so still on AML. So the small number of patients for AML, how quickly do you think that recruitment will take? And additionally, where do you think you might do these trials?
Okay, so different trials will be done in different locations. So if we go to the 5-path strategy, which I'll just pull it up here. So the 2 of the trials we run in the US, so the MRD trial and the pediatric, it's 1 and 3. Number 2, which is the adult, will be run in Israel, and the 2 breast and ovarian cancer will be run in Australia. The reason for doing that is pathways 1 and 3 are approvable pathways. So those trials have the potential to be approved by the FDA off the data of those phase 2 trials. So in order to get a drug approved in the USA, you have to run a trial in the US. You can't run a trial in Australia and then go to the FDA and say, can you approve our drug? They won't allow that, or in Israel. On the other hand, if you're doing proof of concept trials, it's much cheaper to do those trials outside of Australia, particularly as long as you do them in a first world country. So you don't go off to, I won't pick on a country because I'm sure I'll offend somebody, but let's say Tanzania or something like this. You could run a trial there, but no one's going to take much notice of the results. If you run a trial in Australia or Israel, you can run those trials for a fraction of the cost with far less paperwork and complications, but still get an equivalent quality result from that. And so that's the reason why we've split that across. Of course, in this COVID era, it's critically important that we have pathways and locations where you can run trials. So if the US, for example, is not able to run a trial because of COVID issues, well, then you can run those in Israel where there's not a problem, or in parts of Australia where there are no problems. So, yeah, so these types of questions have all been thought about very carefully by the company to ensure that any sort of hurdles can be overcome as we're going along.
Okay, and a related question, which we've received a couple of times, is how much money do you need to get through the planned trials?
Yep.
When might you expect the next?
Okay, so we just did a raise a couple of weeks ago for $3 million. We have $4.7 million in cash in the bank at the moment. We have about another $3.5 million in the money options that will come in over the next 18 months. And we'll expect to receive between $1 million to $1.5 million, maybe even higher, depending on how much we spend in 2021 on R&D tax credits over that time period. So we have between sort of $9 to $10 million in cash over the next 18 months. That's more than enough to fully fund the Israeli trial and the MRD trial, and to do the various works required to get the other trials up and running. Remember, when you run a trial, you don't spend all the money for that trial up front. You put a certain percentage of that up front and then the rest of it along. So we're fully funded through to 2022, even with all our clinical programs in place. And a lot of that's got to do with choosing the right countries where you can get really good bang for your buck. Remember, we're highly motivated as shareholders and management to not waste money and ensure that every single dollar of the shareholders' funds is used productively.
Thank you, Daniel. And actually, that's a great segue. We might make this the last question because we're just running up to time. So how much institutional interest is there in RACE at the moment?
Well, a lot. Institutional investors are interesting. Only once you get over $100 million market cap will most institutional investors start to look at a company. I've spent the last 2.5 weeks talking to institutional investors and about the RACE story, and it's been extremely well received. Obviously it hasn't been on their radar before, but with our re-rate, they can recognise, and particularly when I talk to institutional investors that have biotech and analysts as part of their team, they really understand the strategy here that's going on. So this is a really low risk, where the clinical risk is low because of the historical data, and where the path to market is very rapid. So we're not talking, typically a biotech company might be at the sort of stage that RACE is at, might be 10 years away from having a drug on the market. We're potentially a couple of years away from having a drug on the market. Our cost of running these trials is relatively low. We're not having to run phase 3 trials. This is a very attractive, we know the drug works. We have all that historical data. So that makes it, from a clinical perspective, we're not repurposing the drug. We're basically using it for exactly the same thing that we knew that it worked in the past. So it's from an investment perspective, it's very attractive and very unusual, I think, compared to a lot of other biotech companies out there. So,
well, that sounds like a real high note to finish up. Thank you very much for making time to present today, Daniel. I think what's happening at RACE is really fascinating and there's a lot to look forward to. So I appreciate everybody that made time to join today. And if you'd like to follow RACE, please sign up for email alerts via raceoncology.com and watch our progress via the ASX. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.